when people are failing to make ends meet, when they can't afford to pay for rent and food to eat. And poverty isn't necessarily just the people out living on the streets. It's also the people in hidden poverty who rent out their apartments, but they have to go to the food bank to get food every week because they can't afford to buy food along with the rent because it's too high.
The expectation is that if people need some help, that they must be living in a cardboard box, right, in an alley somewhere, and that's not necessarily the case. Some of these people just don't have the means in order to have an acceptable level of living, and we don't necessarily know the circumstance.
Because the cost of living is so high, it's extremely hard for people to be able to maintain a certain level of living because they have to pay for rent and food and clothes and all these other necessities, but people can't afford it on $10.25 an hour.
What is the poverty line? There's also something called a living wage, about how in order for people to live of a certain standard of living, they have to be able to make a certain amount of money to live in a certain area.
I think the biggest stereotype against the homeless is that they're all involved in drugs and they're all just desperate for the next hit, the next fix, when that isn't always the case. And I think that's really sad because some of them have stories that are just absolutely heartbreaking, and because people just have this preconceived notion of what the homeless are like, that very few people want to help.
Some stereotypes against people in poverty are that everyone does drugs and is on the streets, and most of the people who do drugs to be able to cope with their mental illnesses, because 80% of the people on the streets have mental illness.
Lots of them are just normal people who have had some hard times, and then that was what they were forced to do, and they don't always do drugs. Not everyone is in that situation because of drugs.
And lots of people think that they're lazy and that they don't want to get jobs, but the reality is that they don't really have the resources to be able to go out and look presentable and then go out for a job interview. They don't have any showers or bathrooms to be able to freshen themselves up with to go out to an interview and look presentable.
Everyone just kind of thinks that they did it to themselves, and it's just because they didn't try. And I think that might be the case for some people, but it's definitely not for all. And everyone just kind of thinks they're shady. They're sketchy characters. And I've met quite a few people that were just nice, genuine people who were in a tough situation. And they just wanted people to think of them as people and not as a homeless person.
And another stereotype is that it's all just older males, when really there's a lot of kids in poverty as well as single mothers. So lots of kids are defenseless when their parents are in poverty. They can't really do anything besides sell themselves off or try to sell their stuff. But even then, it's really hard for a kid to be able to provide for their families because kids rely on their parents to provide for them. That's the circle of life. That's how it should be happening. But so many parents aren't able to make enough money to support their kids.
You know, seeing more and more kids on the streets, more and more families, Abbotsford's got one of the highest rates of child poverty in Canada. Yay, us, and child illiteracy rates. Like, I mean, our kids can't even read because of, again, poverty issues, because parents don't have time for this or that, and it just complicates. The layers are beyond an onion. It's insane.
And even if the kids aren't in poverty, if it's just a really well-rounded family and they have enough money to support themselves, and they're going out in the streets and they see these homeless people, what are you supposed to tell them if your kid asks you why that person's out on the street by themselves, all dirty and cold? Because they don't really know what to think of it. And do we want them seeing all these negative things, and do we want to tell them that they can't afford it, that they made bad life decisions, or something really horrible happened to them and they weren't able to make ends meet? Because it's a really horrible thing to tell your children.
In 2010, the child poverty rate was 20.3%, and the single parent family rate was 38.7%. And 40% of the people that Abbotsford Food Bank distributes food to is children.
How do you feel about the fact that kindergarten kids don't eat on the weekend?
We can help people with mental illness by opening more facilities, and providing them with proper medication will help, because we want them to get better, and drugs are just making their mental problems worse. So they need the help. If we could get a facility to help them, that would be great.
Helping them get treatment with, like, giving them free access to treatment, because they don't obviously can't understand things as well as other people, so they might not have as good of an idea of how to get out. So I think the main thing is just helping them to work on their mental illness, and to properly work on it, they need some help.
You can feed them, you can try and give them jobs, but obviously if they can't work, it's more difficult. So it takes money and it takes time to try and help those people and get them help. So definitely charitable organizations that have proper training to deal with those people, but it's hard to find, say, a volunteer psychiatrist, right?
Drugs is a way for people who are living on the streets with mental illness to cope with their mental illness, because most of them didn't start with a drug addiction. They had a mental issue and they got kicked out of their house, so now they resort to drugs to help them cope with their illnesses, because they don't have the proper medication because the government cut funding and no one's there to help them.
Because about 75% of the people on the streets, comfortably, have severe mental health issues. Our government's not doing about that either. You know, like nothing. Right now we have about 300,000 people in Canada are living unsupervised with mental health issues. The city's like, oh, look, we're doing something. They're not. They're really not. It's really disheartening. There's only a few of our council members that are very proactive and very engaged in trying to find solutions.
Incompetence, not necessarily just incompetence though, in the government area, but also they're sort of caught in between not being able to just change everything and then also not wanting to do anything.
For them to be able to do anything, they have to step out of their comfort zone and what they're doing right now, and they can't do that.
Do know that there's, to some extent, there's a limit to what the government can do, because if they just helped everyone who was homeless and gave everyone who was homeless money and tried to give them a place to live, I don't think they could. It's physically possible for them to do that. So then it would lead to trying to choose between which people to help, and I think that'd be a bad road to go down.
The issues are so interrelated. There's such a spectrum of issues, and a lot of it really has to do with the government not putting boundaries in place, putting limitations, and developing a housing strategy, developing a poverty strategy. Because like I said, the UN, since like early 90s, has been yelling at Canada, calling this a crisis, and nothing's been done. But our government is not taking these steps. You know, they're not developing a housing strategy to keep people housed, not developing strategies for low-income developments for people to have affordable housing. No, it's right now it's costing on average to keep somebody outside, not house them, just with police services, with fire, ambulance, hospital costs, and service providers, and things like that to get funding. We're looking on average of $80,000 a year is spent per person, for a homeless person, to keep them outside.
80,000
per year. It's working out to just over $7 billion a year. Our government is throwing out the window to keep people outside. Not coming up with a solution. No solution whatsoever. To socially house a person, to build, say, a housing unit, to get them inside, $3,000 a year. It's obscene. Our government's misspending, putting it in the wrong place. Because poverty and homelessness and addiction, they won't say this publicly, but it's $1 billion a year industry. Would you want to shut down $1 billion a year industry? No, that's not good business, right? So they're not overly motivated. So we have to find ways to motivate them.
I think we should search for is some sort of long-term solutions, because not that quick fixes like soup kitchens aren't great work, but you know, it keeps the homeless alive, but at the end of the day they are still homeless.
I feel if we just increased giving, have more organizations that went out on the streets or to homes that are known to have impoverished people, and give them what they need, and do it anonymously to keep the person's dignity, and just simple things like that can really make a difference.
We have one food bank. We have so many of these facilities in our little area that they all come to our little area, right? Because that's where the access is. So if you're going to have one, you have to have 4, and you have to spread them around, so that everybody can have access to it. I mean, there's homeless people on the other end of Abbotsford too, and there's one food bank for them to get to. I don't, in my personal opinion, I don't know why we don't have a food bank on both ends of Abbotsford, so these people who need it can access it.
We need to get the community involved. Maybe have a community fundraising day, or have a group volunteering day where we all go and help the community.
I think we have to focus on where it's starting and how it happens. And I believe our focus should be the younger generations. And so my theory is, if you wouldn't have homeless adults and homeless elders if you don't have homeless children. So if we take our part in educating children and teens and helping them at the start, they'll know that later on in life, that if they ever get in that situation again, that there's help and that they can get out of it.
And then making sure they're educated and know how to stay out of the situation and how to get out of it.
What we can do to solve these issues is to push awareness and just make sure that it's known in the community that this is a big issue and we need to solve it.
Because in the end, if we don't care about our community, who will?
is preventable.